Hello everybody, my name is John Rick Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reformed GGA, and today I'm going to be doing a post-shooting analysis of my Springfield Hellcat OSP. Now before we get started on that, let's go ahead and check and make sure that the gun is clear. So we have an empty magazine here. I can see that there's nothing in the chamber. I can feel that there is nothing in the chamber, so the gun is safe. And we can go ahead and discuss what it was like to shoot this thing. Now it should be noted that this was not by any means at all meant to be an endurance test or something like that. We didn't go out and shoot thousands of rounds, but myself and a couple other people, we did go out and shoot 4 or 5 magazines through the thing, enough to get an idea of what it was like to shoot. And we also had a bunch of other handguns out there basically to compare and contrast it with. And the overall analysis that pretty much all of us had when we were done shooting at the end of the day is that this thing is small, it is light, it is snappy, it is awkward, but it does shoot. And that pretty much summarizes the post-shooting analysis. Is pretty much everything that I anticipated in my initial impressions video that I did a little while back has been borne out in the actual shooting of it. It's small, and because it's small, it's going to be awkward to grip, and because it's small, it's going to tend to be snappy. It still fires a 9mm cartridge, but in a very lightweight gun, and so it's going to be snappy when you do that, and that's not going to make for an overall pleasant shooting experience. The trigger on it is a little bit on the heavy side, somewhere between, sorry about that, somewhere between 5 3/4 pounds and 6 3/4 pounds, depending on how high up on the trigger you pull it, which is going to be the same with any trigger, by the way. But somewhere in that range, so kind of a 6 to 7-ish pound trigger, roughly. Fairly heavy trigger pull, fairly light gun, not a hugely powerful round, but fairly powerful when you talk about relative to this size of gun, 9mm. Overall, not a particularly pleasant gun to shoot was our impressions, because we compared it to other subcompact and compact and full-size guns that were out there, and it wasn't, certainly wasn't impossible to shoot, but it's just a fact of the matter, it's not going to be as easy to shoot as a full-size gun, no matter how you slice it. One of the people that I was out there shooting with actually came out intentionally just to test his guns to see what he was best at shooting. And it should not come as any surprise to anyone that his 2 best guns were his full-size handguns. He had 2 full-size handguns out there, and lo and behold, they were the ones that he was able to hold the best groups with. And between those two, the one that he was best with was the one that was heavier of the 2, and the one that had the lighter trigger pull. So big guns that are heavy with relatively light trigger pulls tend to be easiest for most people in terms of being able to shoot them accurately. That isn't really news to anyone, and so when you go to something that's kind of at the extreme end of the measure, something that is very lightweight, something that is very small, and with a fairly heavy trigger, you're basically going to get the opposite effect. Instead of something that is very easy to shoot accurately, you wind up with something that is very difficult to shoot accurately. It doesn't take a genius to figure that that's going to be the case. Okay, so with that reality being there, given that this is not going to be an ideal gun to shoot, especially in terms of target practice and precision shooting and those kinds of things, given that limitation, was it acceptable in terms of its performance and accuracy? And for the most part, I would say yes. 2 out of the 3 of us were able to get effective hits at 10, 15, and 25 yards with this thing. The other person who was there who did not get, I would say, effective, or at least reliably effective hits with this thing at 10, 15, and 25 yards was someone who suffered from problems with grip strength, was somewhat arthritic. And small guns are especially problematic for people that are like that. If you're someone who has a compromised grip in any way, shape, or form, a small, snappy, lightweight gun is really not going to perform very well for you, and you're going to wind up suffering from shot anticipation and things like that, especially if you don't shoot very often to begin with. And this person is not someone I would describe as being an avid shooter, someone who shoots on a semi-regular basis, but not someone who goes out and just, will put 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 boxes of ammunition through the gun at a time. Nowhere near that kind of volume. Maybe a box of ammunition, but sometimes a little bit closer to maybe a half a box or maybe even a quarter of a box of ammunition at a time, and I'm talking about a 50-round box. Not truly an avid shooter by any stretch of the imagination. So shot anticipation is going to be an issue. The weak grip strength is going to be an issue. This person also did not have particularly great grip technique, which is very common with certain people. And part of it I get. It's a small gun, and so trying to get a good wraparound hand kind of technique, either with your finger on the trigger, on the offhand trigger finger on the trigger guard, or if you do a low hold, or if you do a wedge technique, whatever the case of your grip, any of those kinds of grips on something that is this small is just going to be awkward. Now, those 3 grips are kind of the typical grips that you would use for a semi-auto for good reason. The main thing is that it keeps your thumbs on the same side and away from the back of the slide. So able to keep both my hands off the slide and forward. If I raise my trigger finger on my offhand, I'm still able to keep my thumbs down and out of the way and forward. If I do the wedge technique, I still am able to keep my thumbs in a good place and get both hands on the gun and keep my wrists, my offhand wrist fairly forward compared to my shooting wrist. Those are the 3 basic grips that you're going to use for a semi-auto. But this particular person found all 3 of those grips, as far as I understand it, to be very uncomfortable, just because of compromised grip strength and the fact that gripping something tightly is somewhat painful for her. And yes, female, that's on the arthritic side. And so gripping the gun in any of those 3 holds that I just gave you, not terribly pleasant for her, made the gun very hard to control and use in that kind of sense. So myself and the other gentleman that was out there, we did okay with it. Again, not as good as with a full-size gun, of course, or a heavier gun, or a gun with a lighter trigger, but manageable. Like I said, we were able to hit 50% IPSC targets at 25 yards, so manageable. It's decent enough accuracy for what it is, but certainly not as good as with other guns. And for the person out there who had poor grip strength combined with poor grip technique, it was not a pleasurable gun at all. And these are all things that would be natural, things that you would expect, and in my initial impressions video I basically said that that was going to be the case, and it has been borne out now. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the gun is bad, but it should be noted that compared to its direct competition that is going up against, which is the SIG P365, which we did have out there as well, it is not the best one in terms of how it feels to shoot it. We had the P365 out there as well. We all shot it to one extent or the other. Actually, I don't know if I got a chance to shoot it this time, but I have shot that one in the past. And we all agreed that the P365 is a more pleasant shooter. Not that it is pleasant, but it's just more pleasant than the Hellcat is. And for a lot of people who are out there, I think that honestly they would be better served by getting the SIG P365. And it's just a more shootable gun. It's still not greatly shootable because it's still a subcompact little thing. It's still going to be very light with a fairly powerful cartridge for that size of gun. So it's still going to be fairly snappy. Awkwardness of getting a good grip on it and all those kinds of things are still going to be there. All that kind of stuff is still going to be relevant. But it is a little bit better shooter. It is a little bit more comfortable in the hand, especially if you get aftermarket hoe grips or something like that, something that fills the hand a little bit more, especially for people who have problems in their hands, arthritis and whatnot, not having to clench down quite as much is going to be a little bit more comfortable for them. So something that takes the grip and widens it out and fills it out a little bit is going to be better for them. Things like that definitely can help and do help. And it also has a little bit lighter trigger. I also think, can't remember exactly if it has a greater sight radius, but the sights that it has are definitely different from these. These are, of course, the U-notch sights. And the U-notch sights are great for being able to pick up the sights quickly and get on target quickly. They're not overly great for precision work, though. The SIG P365 sights, at least on the version that we had out there, are basically the typical 3-dot sights, and they seem to be a little bit more precise for sure. So lighter trigger in the P365, a little bit better sights in terms of precision on the P365, and with aftermarket grips you can certainly make it more comfortable. That would arguably be true of the Springfield as well. Just overall, and the recoil impulse didn't seem to be as jarring with the P365 as well. The Hellcat seemed pretty snappy. The P365 was snappy as well, but not as much. So in terms of just overall shootability, the P365 definitely does win. But that doesn't mean that the Hellcat is necessarily out of the running or that you can't use it, because like I said, I was doing just fine at 25 yards on 50% IPSC targets. It wasn't like it was inaccurate or anything like that, or the U-notch sights prevented me from having any functional accuracy past 10 yards or something like that. They're definitely more useful 10 yards and in, but I was still hitting targets outside of that. That's not a huge problem or anything. Is it, in terms of shootability, as good as its primary competition? No, but it still wasn't inadequate or unusable. And there are also considerations beyond just general shootability to take into account. The biggest one for me is the capacity. What I have in there right now is a 13-round magazine, and also has an 11-round magazine. And the P365, the two main magazine sizes are a 10-round and a 12-round, so you do gain a full round in there. That's not nothing. More is, in fact, more. Another thing that I do like about the about the Hellcat over the P365 is the way that the grip feels. For me, it is a little bit more comfortable because it seems to be a little bit wider across the grip at the top. For the P365, it gets a little bit narrower there, and that caused me to have to clench up even a little bit more, and I already have to clench up pretty tight on this gun to begin with. That one, it's that much more so. And for extended periods, not that this is necessarily going to happen in a self-defense situation, but for extended periods of shooting it, this one is actually a little bit more comfortable for me. Not for everyone, of course, and like I said, there are things that you can do to the P365 with getting aftermarket grips and whatnot on it that can alleviate that. But in their base configuration, as it were, without the hoe grips and all those kinds of things, this one I do find a little bit more comfortable. So better capacity, a little bit more comfortable. Another thing that interests me about the Hellcat over the P365 is that anecdotally, at least, it seems to be a bit more reliable. Now, that doesn't mean that either one is grossly unreliable or anything like that, but there have been some people out on the internet who have done tests where they've taken both of these guns and they've run them without any cleaning or anything like that, just round after round after round after round, until eventually they get a malfunction, and then they record it when that happens. And for people who have done that kind of test, just running it until it finally malfunctions, the P365 seems to malfunction somewhere in the 1,500 to 2,000 round mark. The Hellcat, when people do that same kind of a test, just run it until it finally malfunctions, after, of course, giving it a first good cleaning and the lube up. It seems to get its first malfunction somewhere around the 2,000 to 2,500 round mark. So both of them are well over 1,000 rounds, which is what most self-defense experts would recommend as being your minimum threshold for a carry gun. People like John Correa, John Lavelle, people like that would say, make sure that your gun can go at least 1,000 rounds without malfunctioning, and then if you can do at least that, then start carrying it. Now, how practical that is for the average person to test, especially with ammo prices being what they are right now, is a little debatable. But having at least 1,000 round confidence in the gun, certainly nice, and it kind of seems to be the benchmark for a lot of self-defense experts. So we'll just leave it at there for now. And both the SIG P365 and the Hellcat definitely meet that benchmark. But anecdotally, in the few tests that I've observed, it seems that the Hellcat gets a little bit further before its first malfunction. Therefore, it seems like it is a little bit more reliable. So, better capacity. For me, the base grip feels better than the base grip in the P365. That's, of course, aftermarket adjustable. And it does seem like it is maybe a little bit more reliable. So, those don't necessarily improve the shootability of the gun, but they are not issues that you should perhaps ignore either. There are reasons to like a gun beyond just general shootability. With that said, my overall impressions of the gun now are that, well, I even said it in the first video, Springfields shoot better than they look. This thing does kind of look a little bit awkward, and just in analyzing the stats on it, I thought it was going to be pretty terrible, to be honest. But I also know myself in Springfields, and Springfields usually shoot pretty well for me, even if I'm not particularly a particularly big fan of the gun or of the company. But they do usually shoot fairly well for me, and this one proved to be that way as well. It's definitely not going to be comparable with a full-size gun any day, any time. But it was certainly accurate enough for me, and I did well enough to make it worth my while. And like I said, the added benefits of added capacity, a little bit more comfortable grip, especially for things like dry fire practice and whatnot, that more comfortable grip is a big thing. Are you going to shoot, 500 rounds through the gun in a single session? For a lot of people, probably not. But if it is your carry gun, hopefully you are dry firing it fairly regularly, and having something that's somewhat comfortable to dry fire can be a helpful thing. So this one is a little bit more comfortable that way. And like I said, anecdotally at least, it does seem like it's a little bit more reliable based on the few tests out there that I've seen of people just running the guns until they finally malfunction. Alright, so that is my post-shooting analysis. It's small, it's awkward, it's not overly pleasant, it is not going to compare with full-size guns, duh. But for what it is certainly sufficient. It certainly can get the job done. It is not as shootable as its direct competition, the SIG P365, but there are some other considerations to take into account that may tip the scales in favor of the Hellcat for you, depending on how valuable those things are to you. So that's it. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.